All right, so today we're going to come together and we're going to talk about like knowing your values and how can that help your students in the college and career process later on in their high school career. So this conversation is really applicable to all high school students, and you can begin the conversation about values at any time. But we're really encouraging parents and educators to start having this conversation early on in their, high school career. So, freshman, sophomore, it's even really important for sophomores to start having these conversations. And we're going to go over that a little bit more in my next parent webinar on how to prepare for junior year. So it helps them later on. So what are values? So values are defined as a person's principles, standards, or behavior. So it's also defined as one's judgment that's very important to life. So values tend to motivate students, and sometimes students don't even know what their values are. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, because to help the student understand what their values are is also a very tumultuous process, especially during the high school years, the very formative years. So if you look at like the ethics definition of values, they say its values are society's shared beliefs about what is good or bad and how people should act. So we see a lot of that also in the high school realm, with their peers and, valuing different things that maybe their peers are valuing. So, all of this being said, that I think it's important to start the conversation, and we're going to kind of go through a guideline today on how to start that conversation with your student, how to keep the conversation going, and how to help your student really understand how important this is. Before we kind of go through guidelines and start the conversation, does anyone have any questions or thoughts on values before we begin? No? Okay. So again, at any point, I know this is a little new for some of you. If you want to unmute or use the chat box, feel free to. So if you've attended any of my parent webinars, you have probably heard me say this multiple times. But the first thing we're going to go over is communication. So it tends to be the overarching theme in most of, the chats that I have had thus far this year. But the communication piece is so important. And in this respect for values, the communication piece is important because in order to have students understand what values are and how important they are to them, it's important to make it relevant to their world. So the communication piece is key in order to start the conversation. And, values almost seem theoretical, like something they learn in school or something that doesn't pertain to them yet, unless you're talking about their world. So like some of the examples that I would use when talking to, a student is to exemplify the values is like, should they volunteer somewhere just to volunteer somewhere so it looks good on college? Or should they find a volunteer opportunity that, they're really passionate about? And what makes them passionate about certain volunteer opportunities, and what does that look like? And then right there, that is opening the door to, talk about values, like why do you value this opportunity over that one? And why do you think you like to do this more than that one? So that opens a little bit the door. And a lot of them are also like moral values. I found, your student comes to me and says, my best friend is cheating on all our math tests. Should I tell the teacher? And having that conversation with, well, what do you value? Do you value, friendship, all of that? But really taking things out of their world and connecting it to values is probably the way that you're going to get through to them when it comes to values. So students if you just talk about values like I did before, where you're like, well, the definition of values are, it's going to be very hard for students to realize how that, is within their life and what does that look like. So just try to use real life examples and communicate with them based on their real life examples and what they bring to you. The next thing is modeling. Modeling has also come up in some of our past parent webinars, and how does that work for values? So every day your student is probably watching you and watching, what you value. And even if you think you're not talking about values, it's just the way you live life every day. And it's not just parents, they're watching their educators, they're watching their coaches, they're watching other family members. It's really anyone who is in your student's life, but it's going to leave an impact on them on what they value. So I think it's important to start having these conversations. So like if you're, if you prioritize traveling, so that's something you value in life, when you book the next vacation, just say to your student or, I booked the vacation because I value travel and I think it's important, and, share with them why they think it's important. And they may not connect right away that, you're talking about values and what it means, but down the road, when they start putting all these puzzle pieces together, they'll realize what you were talking about. So right now it's about like the basic communication and laying the groundwork to understand what a value is. The other thing is when they see different people value different things, it influences the way they behave. Whether right or wrong, it just influences the way they behave. So just keep that in mind when you start to have these conversations about different values or, who they're hanging around, or what do they see. Even, when it comes to, we've talked a lot about in the past on these webinars about social media and social media presence and what they're seeing every day there. It all contributes to how they're going to view their values. All right, so we went into a little bit of this, but having a conversation with your students about your values. So one way to do it is when you're modeling the behavior, like we just spoke about, if you, I'm going to use the example again, if you are traveling and you book a trip, explain to your student why you booked the trip. What do you value about booking trips? What do you value about traveling? What does that look like to you? But also the other way you can do it is kind of just sit down and say, you can ask the student point blank, like, what do you value in life? And then if they don't know, and that's okay because they're young and sometimes it needs to be prompted, you then opens the door for you to say, these are some of the things that I value in life. And this is why, I live the way I do, or this is why I've made some decisions that I've made. And you can relate it to personal life, you can relate it to career, you can relate it to lifestyle, and help the students make the connections on your level. So maybe they also don't understand why you make some decisions, and maybe this will be some clarity for them as well, and help them, decide what their own values are in their own time. So something else that's helpful during that conversation, is not just talking about your values, but also picking out a time that maybe you were particularly proud of your student, or maybe a time that something didn't go well in the student's life, and help your student unpack and reflect that. And why did they make the decisions they made? And did it have to do with their values, or are they obsessed with the way they made the decision? Reflection in particular is a really, really, really valuable tool. And it helps students indicate, it helps students indicate what they are thinking. It also helps students indicate, how they feel. And part of values is how do they feel and what do they feel towards these certain things and behaviors. So having that conversation and bringing it back to something that's really relevant in their life, which is a point that we talked about earlier, really helps them distinguish, I didn't like the way I behaved here, and why did I do that? Or I really did, and that's what I value in life, and that's what I want to do more of. So it helps that student gauge, that sense of where they are in their own journey to figure out their values. So along with that conversation, along with that conversation is really reinforcing when you see something that a student does particularly well, or something that you value. So like, one example is like, I noticed how kind you were to Johnny, and you were trying to cheer him up when he was in not such a great place. Or I really appreciated that you were honest with me about what happened at school. And these reinforcers can reinforce what you're seeing in the student and what you think the student values, but the student may not know it themselves. So the student may already not know it. So helping the student distinguish, that may be a value of mine. I am good at talking to people. I really like helping people when they're in need, or I value honesty and I just really want to be honest with everyone that I come into communication with. So helping students unpack some of those experiences that you're witnessing really helps them define and understand their values. And they, again, like we spoke about, they may not make that connection right away. So when they don't make that connection, it's helpful for you to kind of point it out and model it for them. So like the example that I used, I really appreciate you were honest with me in school. I see one of your values, and you can use the word value, so they kind of are understanding. I see that you really value honesty, and I value, if you do, I value honesty as well, and I really appreciate that. And then it can start that conversation about why did they feel they needed to be honest? What prompted them to be honest? And how did that play out? And were they happy with the way the situation played out? And it brings up, excuse me, it generally brings up a lot of feelings, but it does help for students understand where they're at in their own process. So this is a really hard one. And I think, as parents, as educators, as anyone who's trying to talk to a student about anything, not even values, resisting the urge to lecture a student. When talking to students, particularly about values, lecturing them on what's right and wrong, most students will shut down and not reflect and experience their own processes. So it's really important to try to ask probing questions. So we'll go back to the example of, being honest with you of what happened in school. It's really easy to go, down that route of, telling them like, okay, you were honest, but this, really try to refrain and go with the more open-ended questions and have a conversation with the student. Like I said before, why were you honest? What happened? Why do you think this situation occurred? What could have been done differently? What are you most proud of in this situation? And really drawing out what happened and processing and unpacking what happened instead of, telling them what their values should have been in that situation. A student is going to learn from their mistakes, and a student is going to learn from, their own experiences. So helping them get through those experiences and helping them, look at things from a different perspective or asking questions that they may not have thought of in that scenario will help them understand their values. And again, they may not put it together right away, but all of these processes and reflections will help them eventually get there one day. And I think it's important to start doing it now, so that way, when they're in the workforce or when they're in college, they already know how to process things on their own. They're always going to need a support system, but teaching them these strengths to carry on into their years post-driver would be really helpful to them. Some of the examples that are given when trying to teach students, values or family values, what the family values is, one of the examples that was given was to volunteer for something as a family. It exhibits that, you're all on the same team. It exhibits what you may value as a family. And then it tends to open the door for a lot of conversation and reflection out there. So it opens the door in two different ways. One way may be, hey, family, I didn't know we valued this. And it was really nice for us to see all of us come together, and the students can really reflect on that piece of it, because, I value it too. And there may be some open conversation about that. The way it could go too, though, is students would say, I didn't really value this, and I didn't realize we did value this. And having that open communication about, well, why don't they value it, and what were they thinking? And again, going through that process of reflection and probing questions to understand where they're coming from and why they don't see it as a value and what their values are and what happens there. So this all goes back to that open communication piece and understanding your students, but also prompting them to understand themselves, because sometimes it's really hard for them to put everything together because it's such a complex thought for this time. So another example that was given as far as how to exhibit, students' values and what they can and can't do with them is if a student has an idea to start maybe an initiative. So the example that was given was like, a student wants to start a clean up the park initiative with their 5 friends, but they don't know where to begin. Really help them try to make that a reality. Even if it doesn't become a reality, trying to go through the process of making it a reality will help them understand, what they value. It will help them understand that you're in their corner, and it will just exhibit where their passions and values really lie and what they're willing to do to make something happen. So that's a really, really important one. And I think some of our students, have great ideas and awesome ideas. But when it comes time to, going and executing them, they need help. And I think, the help that the support educators can give, as well as parents, it's really impactful on them, and it really tells them, where their values lie and how hard they have to work to get these initiatives done. And some great things come out of Schreiber. So it's always very exciting to see what our students come up with. And within that, talk about passions and hobbies. So some students, you may be sitting here thinking, some students don't even know what their values are. And if I brought up the word values, they may not even interact with that word because it's not important to them right now. And I think then you start with a basic conversation about, like, what are you passionate about? What are your hobbies? What do you like doing with your free time? And then over time, working through that conversation about, can that passion be a value? How can you work with that passion? How can you work with that hobby? And why do you like those things? And why do you like what you do? And I think starting with that, you can then work your way into the values conversation. All right, so that's really like the guidelines of, working through that conversation, working through, a lot of it is communication and open-ended questions, but some really important things to highlight are like the reflection piece, really making it relevant to them and things that they're going through right now, because that would really help them understand and make a connection faster. Are there any questions or thoughts before we move on? Okay, so the last piece that we're going to talk about today is, why is this important for our students? How can this help with college? How can this help with career? Why do we even talk about it? So it's important because a student a student understanding themselves is very important. Just in general, it's shown in research that students who understand their values by the time they go through the college process or the career process tend to make more fluid decisions, and the process seems to go more smoothly for them. That was very recent that was discovered. So right now, schools and educators are trying to back that up into students who are maybe in 9th grade or 10th grade. So by the time they hit that junior year, they understand what their values are when they go through the college process or when they hit senior year and they're looking to go into a career. So how can this help with college? Values come out in very different ways when it comes to college. So it can help students understand what college setting they want to be in. It can help students understand where they want to go to college, like geographic location. So I've worked with some students in the past who say that family is super important to them and they couldn't even think about leaving their family. And that's how they make their college choice based on, geographic location. Something else that values tend to help with is what does a student want to major in? So if a student is really passionate about working with kids, a lot of times those students are going to education, and they know that because they've had experience, they've volunteered, and it helps them make that decision earlier on when they're going through the process. The other thing that values help with is, what will a student participate in college? So if a student really values sports and they're doing high school sports, they'll value doing they'll look for colleges either club sports, a Division 1, 2, or 3 sport, or intramural sports, and being able to participate that in some capacity. So it really helps them understand where they want to go. It also helps them understand what is the mission of the college. So a lot of times people look at missions of colleges and they'll be like, okay, I just know I want to go here. But when students tend to make decisions rooted in values, they tend to look at those missions a little bit more and see what the school is about. And it helps them understand how the school operates. So when making the college list, when going through things, it really helps the students figure things out in a more smooth fashion. So career, it generally helps students, so if a student is going into a career either after college or, right out of high school, when students are rooted in values, it helps them understand what kind of work environment they want to be in, what kind of work do they want to do? Do they want to sit behind a desk all day? Do they want to be out in the field somewhere? Do they want to work with people? Do they want to work by themselves? How does that work? And values in general, whether they're in a college setting or a career setting, they just help students understand, how they'd like to be treated, what is the reflection on them, and how are their outlooks and their behaviors, work with the rest of the student body or the rest of who they're working with. So that's just a short snippet on why values are important and how to start that conversation with students, and really why it's important for them later on. I do want to mention though, if some of you may be sitting here thinking my student is nowhere near figuring out their values, and we haven't even started these conversations, it's okay. Starting this conversation at any point could be helpful for your students, and every student is uniquely different. So helping students just get to that point where they can understand their own values at any point is helpful. So this was not meant to be like a direct timeline. This was just a guideline to help you all, range and go through, the conversations at whatever pace you feel is important for your students. So that's all I have today. I hope you all have a great day, and thank you for joining me. And my next parent webinar will be on how you support your sophomore into the transition of junior year. Thank you.